My name is Alex, and what happened to me during my first semester at college is something that still haunts me to this day. It was a chilling experience that I wouldn't wish upon anyone, and it all started in dorm room 213. I had always been excited about the prospect of college, the freedom it promised, and the new friends I would make. But that excitement turned into fear on the first day I stepped into my dormitory building, and I found myself assigned to room 213. The building itself was old, with creaky wooden floors and dimly lit hallways that seemed straight out of a horror movie. The dormitory had a history, and the rumors among students were that it was haunted. I had brushed off those stories as mere superstitions, thinking they were nothing more than ghost tales to scare newcomers. My roommate, Mark, seemed like a nice guy. We quickly became friends and decided to make the best of our situation. The room itself was small, and the furniture looked as if it had been there for decades. It was a typical college dorm room, nothing out of the ordinary. But things took a strange turn within the first week. Late one night, Mark and I were studying for our midterms. The only source of light in the room was a single desk lamp. As we delved into our textbooks, we heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the windows were closed. Mark heard it too. We glanced at each other, uneasy. The whisper grew louder, and it sounded like a child's voice. It was unintelligible, just eerie, hushed tones that sent shivers down our spines. We searched the room, thinking someone might be playing a prank on us, but there was no one there. We tried to dismiss it as our imagination, but it was hard to ignore. Over the next few weeks, the whispers became more frequent, often occurring in the dead of night. We started to experience strange occurrences. Our belongings would be moved when we were sure we hadn't touched them, and the room's temperature would fluctuate wildly. Sometimes the room would become icy cold, and we could see our breath, even though it was the middle of September. Mark and I talked to our neighbors, and they reported similar experiences. Some claimed to have seen shadowy figures lurking in the hallways at night, while others had heard the whispers too. It was clear that something was amiss in our dormitory building. One night, as Mark and I were lying in our beds, trying to sleep despite the unsettling atmosphere, the room suddenly plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to look for the source of the problem. The light revealed nothing out of the ordinary until it reached our closet. The closet door was slowly creaking open, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow all light. I shone the flashlight inside, and to my horror, I saw a pair of gleaming red eyes staring back at me from within the closet. Mark and I screamed in terror and scrambled out of our beds, rushing out of the room. We spent that night in the common room, too scared to return to room 213. The next morning, we filed a complaint with the dormitory management, but they assured us that there was no issue with the room's wiring or anything else that could explain the strange occurrences. Desperate for answers, Mark and I decided to do some research. We discovered that room 213 had a tragic history. Decades ago, a young boy had lived there with his family. One night, the boy had disappeared without a trace, and his parents had been devastated. The room had been vacant ever since, and rumors of paranormal activity had swirled around it. We felt a deep sense of unease, knowing that whatever haunted our dormitory had a connection to that missing boy. Mark and I started documenting our experiences, taking photographs and recording the whispers whenever they occurred. As the semester progressed, the encounters became more intense. We witnessed objects levitating, heard disembodied laughter, and even saw the shadowy figure of a young boy standing at the foot of our beds. The once friendly atmosphere between Mark and me deteriorated as fear took its toll on our sanity. One night, unable to take it anymore, we decided to hold a seance in the room. We gathered a few friends and used a makeshift Ouija board to try and communicate with whatever was haunting us. The room grew cold, and the planchette moved erratically, spelling out chilling messages that filled us with dread. It said, "I am trapped. Help me." We were paralyzed with fear, unsure of how to help the spirit find peace. It was clear that the boy's restless spirit was trapped in room 213, and we were caught in the middle of a terrifying supernatural ordeal. Things reached a breaking point one fateful night, when Mark and I were alone in the room. The whispers grew into agonizing cries, and the room was filled with an otherworldly, anguished wailing. The walls seemed to bleed, and the air turned so cold that our breath formed icy clouds. It was a nightmare beyond imagination. Suddenly, the closet door burst open, and the spectral figure of the young boy emerged, his eyes filled with sorrow and torment. He pointed at us, his voice echoing in our minds, "Help me, please." We couldn't bear it any longer. Mark and I fled the room, never to return. We begged the dormitory management to let us move to another room, and they complied, no questions asked. To this day, I can't explain what happened in room 213, but I know it was real. The horror we experienced was far beyond anything I had ever imagined, and it left an indelible mark on my psyche. I've heard that the room remains vacant, a dark and forbidding place that no one dares to enter. I've since graduated from college, but the memory of that dormitory still haunts me. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that happen in real life, and the inexplicable horrors that lurk in the shadows are far more terrifying than any ghost story. It was the fall of 2003 when I first stepped foot onto the sprawling campus of Oak Ridge University. Excitement and nervousness mingled as I moved into my college dorm, room 213. Little did I know that this room held a dark secret, one that would haunt my every night and change the course of my life forever. The dormitory itself was a typical four-story building with dimly lit hallways, narrow staircases, and a history that seemed to whisper from its aged bricks. Room 213 was on the second floor, tucked away in a quiet corner of the building. It had an eerie feel to it, but I attributed it to the overactive imagination of a freshman. The first few weeks were relatively uneventful. My roommate Mark and I were getting along well, and our studies kept us busy. However, as autumn turned into winter, strange occurrences began to unfold. It started with subtle noises in the dead of night, whispers that barely grazed my ears, and eerie shadows that danced on the walls. One particularly cold night, I was jolted awake by the feeling of someone watching me. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, scanning the room. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting eerie shapes across the floor. That's when I noticed it. A shadowy figure in the corner of the room. Panic washed over me as I realized there was no one else in the room besides Mark, who was sound asleep in his bed. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was a trick of the mind, but the shadow persisted. It seemed to sway gently, as if it had a life of its own. I mustered the courage to speak. "Who's there?" My voice trembled. No response. The figure remained unmoving, its presence sending shivers down my spine. Slowly, I reached for my phone on the nightstand, illuminating the room with its soft glow. But when I turned the light towards the corner, the shadow dissipated, leaving nothing but an empty room. I was convinced I had imagined it, blaming it on the stress of exams and lack of sleep. Yet, as the weeks passed, the encounters with the shadowy figure became more frequent. Each time it would appear, and I would summon the courage to confront it, only for it to vanish like smoke. One evening, I confided in Mark about the strange happenings in our room. He was skeptical but agreed to spend a night monitoring for any unusual activity. We kept the lights off and waited in silence. It didn't take long for the whispers to start, faint and incomprehensible at first, but then they grew louder and more distinct, as if someone were speaking directly into our ears. Mark's face turned pale as he whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, unable to find my voice. We strained to listen, and the words became clearer. "Get out! Leave this place! Run!" Terrified, we turned on the lights, but there was no one there. The room was empty, and the whispers had ceased. Mark and I decided to investigate the history of room 213, hoping to find some answers. It didn't take long to uncover a dark truth. Decades ago, a student named Sarah had occupied room 213. She was known for her intense fascination with the occult, and conducted bizarre rituals within the very walls we now slept. Rumor had it that she summoned something malevolent, and one night she vanished without a trace. Desperate to rid ourselves of this haunting presence, we sought the help of a local paranormal expert. He conducted a seance in our room, attempting to communicate with whatever lurked there. As we sat in a circle, candles flickering, we felt a sudden drop in temperature and heard the whispers once more. The expert's face contorted with fear as he muttered, "Sarah, you must leave this place. Release the soul you've trapped here." Suddenly, a violent gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging us into darkness. An otherworldly scream echoed through the room, and the air grew thick with a suffocating malevolence. We fled the room, our hearts pounding. In the days that followed, room 213 remained empty, sealed off by the university. Mark and I were relocated to another dorm, far from the haunting memories of that room. But the terror of those nights still lingers in my mind, a constant reminder that some horrors are very real, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be unleashed. It was my sophomore year in college when I moved into Oakwood Hall, a historic dormitory that had stood on campus for over a century. The building had an eerie charm to it, with its creaky wooden floors and dimly lit hallways. Little did I know this dorm would become the setting for a horrifying experience that still haunts my dreams to this day. I was assigned to room 303, a small and gloomy space that seemed to be stuck in time. The walls were adorned with faded floral wallpaper, and the windows were so old that they barely let any light in. My roommate, Mark, was a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself. We didn't have much in common, but we got along well enough. The first few weeks in Oakwood Hall were relatively uneventful. However, as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, strange things started happening. It all began with subtle noises in the middle of the night. At first, I dismissed them as the usual creaks and groans of an old building, but soon, those sounds became louder and more distinct. One night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard whispers coming from the corner of the room. I couldn't make out the words, but the voices sounded malevolent, like they were plotting something sinister. My heart raced, and I nudged Mark awake. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark stirred and mumbled something incoherent, clearly annoyed at being woken up. But then he froze, his eyes widening as he too heard the eerie whispers. We turned on the lights, but the room was empty. The voices had stopped, leaving us in a state of confusion and fear. We rationalized it as a shared nightmare, convincing ourselves that the stress of college was getting to us. But the whispers were just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the dorm room became a hotbed of paranormal activity. Objects would move on their own, books would fall off the shelves, and the temperature in the room would inexplicably drop to bone-chilling levels. One night, I woke up to find Mark levitating above his bed, his body contorted in unnatural angles. I screamed, and as if on cue, he dropped back onto his bed, unconscious. When he finally woke up, he had no memory of what had happened, but his face was etched with fear. We decided to seek help and consulted a local paranormal investigator, Dr. Evelyn Hart. She was a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense attitude and a wealth of experience dealing with the supernatural. After listening to our story, she agreed to conduct an investigation. Dr. Hart arrived at Oakwood Hall armed with an array of equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and voice recorders. She conducted a thorough examination of our room, and her expression grew graver with each passing minute. "There's definitely something here," she muttered under her breath. As night fell, we huddled in the dimly lit room, surrounded by Dr. Hart's equipment. She instructed us to remain silent and not to provoke whatever entity was inhabiting our space. The room grew colder, and an oppressive feeling settled in the air. Dr. Hart began to ask questions aloud, addressing the entity that lurked in the shadows. The temperature dropped even further and the walls seemed to close in on us. Then, it happened. A deep, guttural voice responded, speaking through Mark. He wasn't himself anymore. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his voice was no longer his own. "I am trapped here," the voice hissed. "I died in this room long ago, and I can never leave." Terror coursed through me as I realized we were not alone in that room. Dr. Hart continued to communicate with the entity, trying to uncover the truth behind its torment. It revealed a chilling tale of a student who had lived in this very room decades ago. He had been conducting dark experiments in an attempt to summon a malevolent spirit, but the ritual had gone horribly wrong. The spirit had possessed him, and he had died a gruesome death. Now, his restless spirit was trapped in the room, forever tormented by the entity he had unleashed. Dr. Hart attempted to perform a cleansing ritual to release the spirit from its eternal torment. As she chanted incantations and sprinkled salt around the room, a deafening roar filled the air. The walls shook, and the room seemed to twist and contort in unnatural ways. Suddenly, with a blinding flash of light, the entity was gone. Mark collapsed, exhausted and drained, but he was no longer possessed. We never experienced any paranormal activity in our room again, but the memory of that night haunted us both. Mark transferred to a different dorm, and I moved out of Oakwood Hall as soon as the semester ended. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that room, and I'm not sure I want to know. The experience changed me, leaving me with a lingering fear of the unknown. I learned that some secrets are best left buried, and that sometimes the past can reach out from beyond the grave to claim the living. As for Oakwood Hall, it still stands on campus, its dark history hidden beneath layers of faded wallpaper and creaky floorboards. But if you ever find yourself in room 303, remember this story, and be wary of the whispers in the night, for you may not be alone in the darkness.